The night was heavy with rain in Kisumu when life changed for Achieng. Her husband, Otieno, had gone out for work as usual, but by evening she got the news no wife ever wants to hear. There had been an accident. By the time she reached the hospital, her strong, cheerful husband lay motionless on the bed, his body broken. The doctors said he would live, but he might never walk again. Achieng held his hand and prayed, her heart sinking as she saw the man who had once been her pillar now lying helpless. At first, her in-laws seemed to share her grief. They spoke softly, offering comfort, but it didn't last. Soon, their words grew sharp, their eyes accusing. They whispered that she had brought bad luck, that she was the reason their son had fallen. It was as if the love and warmth they had once shown her had vanished overnight. Every time she entered the room, the air grew cold. Conversations would stop suddenly, and Achieng could hear her name spoken in bitter tone. Then came the hushed talks about land, property, and who would take control of Otieno's belongings if he never recovered. She tried to ignore it, focusing only on caring for her husband, but the weight of their stares and the sting of their words cut deep. The accident had not only broken Otieno's body, it had opened a wound in the family. Achieng felt it. This was just the beginning of a fight she never imagined she would face. At first, Achieng tried to tell herself that the tension in the house would pass. Maybe her in-laws were just stressed because of Otieno's condition. Maybe grief was making them act differently. But slowly, she began to notice the small, painful changes that could not be ignored. One evening at dinner, she realized her plate had less food than everyone else's. At first, she thought it was a mistake. She even laughed softly and said nothing. But the next day, it happened again. While others had full plates of ugali and fish, hers was half empty. She sat quietly, eating slowly, swallowing not just the food but also the lump of shame rising in her throat. The silence in the house became louder than words. Whenever she walked into a room, conversations died. Laughter ended. People who had once welcomed her with warmth now looked away. She began to feel like a stranger in the very home she had built with her husband. Then one night, something cut her deeper than all the whispers. At the family table, where she always sat beside Otieno, her chair was gone. She stood there for a moment, holding a bowl in her hand, pretending not to notice. Her mother-in-law motioned coldly to a corner, saying, "Sit there." The humiliation burned inside her. She obeyed quietly, her back straight, her eyes wet but unblinking. Yet in her heart, Achieng still clung to hope. She told herself that love could not disappear so easily, that perhaps with time, her in-laws would remember who she was. Not just their son's wife, but a woman who had loved him deeply, cared for him, and become part of their family. She prayed each night beside Otieno's bed, whispering, "They will see me again. They will love me again." But the house no longer felt like a home. Every small act of cruelty reminded her that something darker was growing beneath the surface. It wasn't just grief, it was greed. She could hear it in their hushed voices, the way they spoke about land and property, as if she were invisible. The walls of the house seemed to close in on her, but she forced herself to smile, to serve, to stay strong for her husband. Deep inside, though, Achieng felt the crack in her heart widen. She wondered how long she could carry the weight of their rejection, how long love could stand against cruelty dressed in silence. She didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning of her true test. It was a cold evening when everything Achieng had feared finally came crashing down. She had just finished feeding Otieno, wiping his face gently the way she always did, when Mama and Jerry stormed into the room. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. "You are nothing without my son," she spat, her eyes full of anger. The words pierced Achieng's heart, leaving her frozen where she stood. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. But Mama and Jerry's next words made it clear. She wanted Achieng out of the house. The air in the room grew heavy. Other family members gathered, some with folded arms, others with smirks that said they had been waiting for this moment. Achieng's hands trembled as she tried to plead. "Mama, this is my home too. I belong here. I am his wife." But her words only fueled the fire. Mama and Jerry stepped closer, her finger pointing at the door. "Go. We don't want you here. Take your curses with you." Before Achieng could move, two of her brothers-in-law began pulling her clothes from the closet, tossing them into a sack like they were trash. Her shoes, her dresses, even her wedding kaitenge, all thrown out without care. She rushed to stop them, her voice breaking. "Please don't do this. Otieno needs me." But no one listened. It was as if her love, her years in that house, meant nothing. Moments later, she found herself standing outside in the mud, her belongings scattered at her feet. The rain had started again, soaking the clothes, the books, the little things she had cherished. Her heart pounded as she looked around and saw the neighbors gathered, watching from their doorways. Some whispered, others shook their heads, but no one stepped forward to defend her. Their silence was louder than Mama and Jerry's cruel words. Achieng wanted to scream, to demand justice, but her throat felt tight. She bent down, picking up her wet clothes with shaking hands, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. Every step she took away from that house felt like walking barefoot over sharp stone. Her dignity had been stripped in front of everyone, yet she held her head high, repeating her late father's words in her heart. Never let them see you bow. Behind her, she could still hear the laughter and whispers of her in-laws, celebrating her humiliation as though it were a victory. She didn't look back. The pain was already too deep. That night, under the dim streetlights of Kisumu, carrying a torn bag of clothes and a heart heavy with sorrow, Achieng walked into a new chapter of her life. She had lost her home, her safety, her place in the family she once loved. But what she didn't know was that this cruel eviction was only the spark that would awaken a fire inside her, one that no storm could ever put out. The night Achieng was thrown out of her home, she had nowhere to go. The rain soaked her clothes, and the muddy streets of Kisumu felt colder than ever. Clutching her bag of scattered belongings, she thought of the one person she could turn to, her childhood friend, Wanjiru, who now lived in Kibera. With a heavy heart and trembling steps, she made her way there, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. Wanjiru welcomed her with open arms. "You will not sleep in the streets while I'm alive," she said, pulling her friend into a tight embrace. Her small, one-room house in Kibera was far from comfortable, but to Achieng, it felt like a shelter from a storm. She placed her wet clothes in a corner and sat quietly on the old mattress Wanjiru spread for her. The silence was heavy, and though she tried to smile, the tears finally escaped. Days passed, but the pain didn't ease. Every morning, Achieng woke up with the image of her belongings being tossed into the mud, her mother-in-law's voice ringing in her ears. "You are nothing without my son." The words played like a broken record, cutting her deeper than any knife. In the busy, noisy streets of Kibera, she felt invisible. People walked by, chasing their own struggles, unaware of the storm inside her. But in the quiet of the night, when the city noises faded, something else began to stir in her heart. Grief was still there, yes, but so was a growing fire. She remembered her late father, a man of few words but strong one. As a little girl, he would always tell her, "Never let them see you bow." At the time, she hadn't understood the weight of those words. But now, sitting on a thin mattress in her friend's house, she realized he had been preparing her for this moment. She replayed his wisdom in her mind each time doubt tried to crush her. Stand tall, Achieng, even when the world wants you to bend. She began to see that her in-laws' cruelty was not just about grief, it was about greed. They wanted to break her so they could take what was hers. But her father's voice reminded her that she still had her dignity, her courage, and her faith. Wanjiru often tried to cheer her up. "You are stronger than you think," she told her, handing her a plate of githeri one evening. "Do not let them win." Achieng would nod quietly, her eyes focused, her heart slowly rebuilding itself. Though she was homeless and humiliated, she began to rise inside. Each sleepless night added fuel to the fire burning in her chest. She was no longer the broken woman crying in the rain. She was a lioness learning to roar in silence, waiting for the right moment to show the world that she was far from finished. One afternoon in Kibera, while Wanjiru was out selling vegetables, Achieng sat quietly in the small room, sorting through the few belongings she had managed to save. Most of what the in-laws had thrown into the mud was ruined, but tucked inside her torn handbag was a bundle of papers she had carried with her for years. She had almost forgotten about them. With trembling hands, she began to open the old brown envelope. The first paper she pulled out was her marriage certificate. She stared at it for a long time, her eyes tracing her name beside Otieno's. Memories came rushing back. Her wedding day, the joy in his eyes, the promises they made to each other. For a moment, her heart softened, but then the bitterness returned. That family, the same people who had celebrated with them on that day, now treated her like she was nothing. She dug deeper into the envelope, unfolding more documents, and then her hands froze. There it was, a property deed. At first, she thought it belonged to Otieno, but as her eyes scanned the bold black letters, she felt her breath catch. The house she had been thrown out of was not in his name at all. It was in hers. Her name, Achieng Otieno. She read it again and again, as if her mind could not believe what her eyes were seeing. Tears welled up, but these were not tears of grief. They were tears of shock, of revelation. The house, the very place where she had been humiliated and cast out, had been gifted to her by her husband before the accident. Otieno had loved her enough to secure her future, to give her something that could never be taken away, or so he thought. Her heart pounded as anger and relief collided inside her. How dare they throw her out of her own home? How dare they strip her of her dignity when the truth was written clearly on paper? For the first time since the accident, she felt power stir in her chest. She wasn't just a widow in waiting clinging to pity. She was the rightful owner of the house they had stolen from her. She clutched the deed to her chest, whispering to herself, "Baba, I will not bow." It felt as if her late father's voice echoed in the room, stronger than ever. Her grief began to turn into determination. For weeks she had been silent, enduring cruelty, but now she had proof that justice was on her side. When Wanjiru returned that evening, she found Achieng sitting upright, her eyes no longer dull with sorrow but blazing with new strength. "What happened?" Wanjiru asked. Achieng held up the deed with a trembling smile. "This house is mine. They tried to break me, but they don't know who I am. I will not let them win." That night, for the first time in a long time, Achieng slept with peace in her heart. She knew the fight was far from over, but now she held the weapon that could change everything. The morning sun was sharp over Kisumu when Achieng finally decided it was time. For days she had stared at the deed, running her fingers over her name, gathering the courage to do what once seemed impossible. She wrapped the papers neatly in a plastic cover, tied her lasso around her waist, and stood in front of Wanjiru's small mirror. What she saw staring back was not the broken woman who had been thrown into the mud. It was a woman reborn, a lioness, silent but fierce. When she arrived at the gate of the house, her heart beat loudly in her chest, but her steps were steady. The compound looked the same, yet different. It no longer felt like a home, it felt like stolen ground. She pushed open the gate and walked in. Heads turned. Her sisters-in-law whispered. Children stopped playing to stare. And then Mama and Jerry appeared at the doorway, her face twisted with disdain. "What are you doing here?" Mama and Jerry barked. "We told you never to come back." Achieng didn't flinch. She stood tall, holding the deed in her hand. Her voice was calm, steady. "This house is mine. My husband gave it to me before the accident. You will leave today." For a moment, there was silence. Then came the laughter, cruel, mocking, rolling out of their throats like fire. One brother-in-law slapped his knee, shaking his head. "This woman has lost her mind. Look at her, thinking she has power." Another sneered. "If this house is yours, then show us your strength. Push us out if you can." Their mockery stung, but Achieng did not raise her voice. She knew shouting would only feed their pride. Instead, she unfolded the deed slowly, raising it for all to see. "My name is written here," she said firmly. "Not Otieno's, not Mama's. Mine. You can laugh today, but the law will not laugh with you." They scoffed louder. One of the women stepped forward and tried to snatch the paper from her hands, but Achieng held it tightly to her chest. "Do what you want," she said, her eyes steady. "But I am not afraid anymore. You threw me out once, but this time I will not walk away. If you refuse to leave peacefully, then the law will remove you." Mama and Jerry spat on the ground, her face hard with fury. "You think a piece of paper will save you? You are still nothing. A woman without a man is like dust in the wind." But Achieng only looked at her with calm eyes. The insults no longer cut the way they used to. "Dust can still blind you," she replied softly. The compound grew quiet at her words. For the first time, they saw not the weak woman they had humiliated, but a fire they had underestimated. The silent lioness had returned to her den, and though they laughed, fear was beginning to creep into their eyes. Deep down, they knew the fight was no longer theirs to win. The day of the hearing arrived, and Achieng woke before dawn. She wrapped her documents carefully in a folder, smoothing the edges as though they were her own children. Her heart pounded, but she whispered a prayer to steady herself. Wanjiru held her hand at the bus stop, saying, "Walk in there with your head high. You are not fighting for pity, you are fighting for what is already yours." The Nairobi High Court was a world of its own. Tall pillars, echoing halls, and the smell of old wood mixed with fear and hope. Achieng's legs trembled as she walked through the doors, but her back remained straight. She had promised herself she would not bow. Her in-laws were already there, sitting together like a pack ready to attack. When Mama and Jerry saw her enter, she scoffed loudly. "She thinks paper will make her a queen," she muttered, loud enough for others to hear. Her sons snickered, one even whispering, "This will be fun." Their voices echoed like knives, but Achieng kept walking, each step firm, her folder clutched tightly against her chest. When the case was called, the judge, an older man with sharp glasses, asked Achieng to speak. She stood, her voice calm though her hands shook slightly. "Your Honor, this house was gifted to me by my husband before his accident. I have here the deed that proves my ownership." She placed the papers on the desk, sliding them carefully toward the judge. Before the judge could even look, her in-laws erupted. "Lies!" one brother-in-law shouted. "She bewitched our son." Mama and Jerry pointed a shaking finger at her. "She is nothing but a greedy woman trying to steal what belongs to our family." The courtroom filled with noise, their insults flying like arrows. But then came the judge's gavel, 3 loud bangs that silenced the room. His voice cut through the chaos, firm and unshakable. "Enough! This is a court of law, not a market." His eyes shifted from the noisy family to the quiet woman standing alone. He opened the folder, adjusted his glasses, and read carefully. The room was so still that even breathing felt loud. Finally, he looked up. His voice carried the weight of finality. "The deed is clear. The rightful owner of the house is Achieng Otieno. No one else has a claim. Gasps filled the courtroom. Achieng's knees nearly gave way, but she held herself upright, tears pricking her eyes. Her in-laws sat frozen, their mouths open in disbelief. The same people who had mocked her now looked small, powerless. Mama and Jerry tried to protest, but the judge raised his hand sharply. This matter is settled. Any further interference with her property will face the full punishment of the law. Achieng bowed her head slightly, not in defeat, but in gratitude. She had walked into the courtroom as a woman they had called powerless. She walked out as the rightful owner, her dignity restored. The lioness had roared, and the world had finally heard her. After the ruling, the courtroom emptied slowly, but the silence between Achieng and her in-laws was louder than any word. They sat huddled together on the benches, their faces pale with shock. The arrogance they had carried into the courtroom was gone, replaced by fear and shame. Mama and Jerry, who had once spat venom at her, now looked smaller, almost fragile. As Achieng picked up her folder and prepared to leave, her brother-in-law rushed forward. His voice trembled, no longer mocking. "Sister, forgive us. We didn't know. We only wanted to protect what was ours." His eyes darted to the floor, unable to meet hers. Then Mama and Jerry, her face lined with defeat, reached for Achieng's hand. "My daughter, please," she whispered, tears welling. "We were wrong. Don't turn your back on us. Forgive a mother's mistake." The same woman who had dragged her name through the mud, who had thrown her clothes into the street, was now begging for mercy. For a moment, Achieng stood frozen. Part of her wanted to scream, to remind them of every cruel word, every insult, every night she had cried herself to sleep. She wanted to ask if they had thought of forgiveness when they humiliated her in front of neighbors, when they stripped her of dignity. But no words came. Instead, her eyes filled with tears, and she turned her face away. The tears that rolled down her cheeks were not for them. They were not born out of pity for people who had tried to destroy her. They were for herself, for the girl who had once believed she was powerless, for the woman who had survived storms she never thought she could. She was crying for the strength she had discovered, the kind her father had spoken about when he said, "Never let them see you bow." Her silence spoke louder than forgiveness or revenge. She gently pulled her hand away from Mama and Jerry's grasp and walked toward the door. The click of her shoes on the tiled floor echoed through the hall, each step a reminder that she was no longer the woman they had tried to break. Behind her, her in-laws whispered apologies, but she didn't look back. For the first time, she understood that forgiveness did not always mean letting someone back into your heart. Sometimes, forgiveness was simply releasing the pain and walking away stronger. Outside the court, the sun was shining. Achieng tilted her head up, letting the warmth touch her face. The world around her looked brighter, freer. People passing by had no idea of the war she had just won, both in the courtroom and inside her own soul. Her tears dried quickly, replaced by a steady calm. This was her turning point. She had walked through fire, and though it had burned her, it had also shaped her into steel. She was no longer the woman who begged for acceptance. She was the lioness who had found her roar, and nothing would ever silence her again. The day Achieng walked back into her house, the air in Kisumu felt different. The gate that had once closed on her now swung open with ease, as though it too knew the rightful owner had returned. She carried no bitterness in her step, only quiet strength. The same neighbors who had once watched her belongings thrown into the mud now stood by the roadside, whispering in awe. Some nodded respectfully, others offered shy smiles. They had pitied her before, but today they admired her. Her in-laws had already packed their things and left. The compound was silent, almost too silent. Achieng walked slowly across the yard, her hand brushing against the walls as if to remind herself it was real, that this was hers. The house no longer felt like a place of humiliation. It felt like a crown she had fought for and finally placed on her head. When she opened the front door, memories rushed in. She saw herself feeding Otieno on that bed, saw the chair they had taken from her at the table, saw the night her clothes had been tossed out into the rain. But instead of breaking her, the memories made her stand taller. She whispered to the empty room, "I am home." The news of her victory spread quickly. Women from the neighborhood came to greet her, some holding her hands tightly, others saying, "We saw what they did to you. We prayed for you." Men who had once looked at her with pity now lowered their heads in respect. Children stared at her like she was a story come to life. Achieng smiled, not out of pride, but out of gratitude, for she knew her battle was bigger than herself. She had shown every woman watching that silence does not mean weakness. Inside the house, she moved from room to room, straightening chairs, wiping dust, humming softly to herself. Every action was a declaration. She belonged here. No one could take this from her again. The walls seemed to echo her strength. The floors held her steps with pride. She was no longer a guest in her own home. She was its heart, its center, its rightful keeper. That evening, as the sun set over Lake Victoria, Achieng sat on the veranda, watching the sky burn orange and red. The same neighbors who had once turned away during her eviction now greeted her warmly as they passed. Some even stopped to chat, telling her she had inspired them. She listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes calm. She did not need loud celebrations. Her victory was in the silence, in the peace she now carried. She had been dragged through the mud, stripped of dignity, laughed at, and cast aside. But she had returned, not just to a house, but to herself. Achieng was no longer the woman they tried to crush. She was unshaken, unbroken, and unforgettable. The lioness was finally home, and this time, she would never bow again. Weeks after Achieng moved back into her home, Otieno's health began to improve. The man who had once lain helpless on a hospital bed was slowly learning to sit, then to walk with help. One afternoon, when he was strong enough to return home, he looked around the compound in confusion. "Where is everyone?" he asked softly. It was then Achieng told him everything. She spoke gently but truthfully, how his mother had spat cruel words, how his brothers had thrown her clothes into the mud, how she had been humiliated before neighbors. She told him about the courtroom, about the deed he had signed to her name, the very act of love that became her shield. Otieno sat in silence, his face heavy with shame. Tears filled his eyes. "I trusted them," he whispered. "I never thought my own blood could betray you, could betray us." Achieng placed her hand over his. "You were not there to see it, Otieno. But I was. And I survived." Her voice was calm, steady, not bitter. She had already made peace with the truth. When he begged her for forgiveness, for not protecting her, for not stopping them, she nodded. "I forgive you," she said softly. But about his family, her silence spoke louder than any words. She would never forget. That night, as Otieno rested, Achieng sat by the window, staring out at the stars. She thought of her journey, of how close she had come to breaking, and how she had risen instead. Her father's words echoed once more. "Never let them see you bow." The story of Achieng became a whisper across Kisumu, and the moral was clear. Never underestimate the woman you call weak. She may own everything you stand on.